Back in biblical times, law and order was often enforced by ruthless rulers and violent thugs who did their bidding. Arbitrary laws and uneven enforcement were designed primarily to terrify the citizenry and prop up or shield kings in the constellation of their corrupt allies. Meanwhile, religious authorities citing religious texts would ensure their adherents' compliance in all manner of life in theocratic cultures. Those who defied their strictures faced ridicule, banishment, torture, and sometimes even death. And of course, the general public often operated with a set of rules or values that weren't necessarily codified, yet commonly understood. Those who were deemed out of line could be reprimanded, shamed, publicly humiliated, or even subjected to violence. Though a tyrant could condemn and execute an innocent person, the accused could commonly mount at least a modest defense and or appeal to their accusers for some degree of grace or leniency. But scarce Bible citations reveal that acquittals or dismissals were quite rare. The adulterous woman who admits to an affair but wasn't stoned by an angry mob for her indiscretions is one uncommon exception. But even innocent Jesus was condemned to die a most ignominious death based on false testimony and trumped-up charges. And some wonder if justice has been elusive ever since. A society that promotes fairness, equity, decency, propriety, and honor have been lauded by democratic institutions for centuries. Rules, regulations, and laws have been enacted to meet these ideals in countless democratic nations, but they all come up short in their results. Lawlessness and disorder seems to wend their way into everything. They re-enter into society just as the police and regulatory agencies earnestly try to drive them out. Consequently, peace was rarely achieved anywhere, and justice was uneven at best everywhere. In the last century, police were once called peace officers for their role in ensuring calm and order on their beats. Most of them served their communities with honor and respect, and were instrumental in mitigating violence and graft. Of course, not every police officer was faultless, but there was a general respect and admiration for all but a handful of bent coppers or corrupt cops who regarded themselves as above the law. There will always be a handful of people in any profession who refuse to abide by the laws they are charged to submit to or to enforce, and so some regulatory efforts seem warranted in most cases. So recent reforms and citizen review panels and tougher state and federal laws and more have been enacted to regulate police forces so citizens could feel safe from deadly apprehensions, false charges, unfair trials, and disproportionate prison sentences. I think even local constabularies and lawmakers and attorneys would agree that some reforms are still needed. But recent police shootings have been sensationalized, upending hard-earned trust and giving one the impression that the police are largely a fraternity of gun-toting thugs who are obsessed with violence and are sanctioned to kill even when it may appear unwarranted. Recent demonstrations have also fueled antipathy for the police, and surely there are incidents of professional malpractice. There needs to be accountability, and there is ample room for more reforms, but I wonder if we need to promote justice and listen to police officers, or justices of the peace, who dedicate their lives to protect their constituencies. So I asked a friend and retired police officer to clear up some common misunderstandings. I hope you stay tuned. Hi, this is Pastor Don Shipley, and I'm delighted to have a friend and former church member, Steve Mark Steiner from Shelton, Washington, come and have a conversation about policing. Steve, could you please introduce yourself and tell us your background?
Sure. My name's Steve Marksteiner. I am now a retired police officer. I served on the Dallas Police Department for a total of 23 years. I did 14 years in uniform patrol on the street. I did 6 years as the police helicopter observer and pilot. And then the last 3 years I was on duty, I did a little bit of both. I hold a Master Peace Officer certification in the state of Texas, the highest certification that the state bequeaths upon a peace officer. And I also hold an instructor certification from the Texas Commission of Law Enforcement Standards and Education.
You stress the fact that you are a peace officer. These days in the news, there's a lot of unrest among the police and so on. I wanted some clarification so that people understand what's the process and routine when you go about apprehending a suspect. There are obviously cases that we've seen on video and YouTube and so on of things that went sideways and went south pretty quickly. But what's the typical procedure? Let's say, for instance, I have an arrest. There's an arrest warrant for me. How would you go about arresting me and you found me driving a vehicle, for instance?
Well, I'll be glad to go into the details, but the first thing I wanted to mention before we launched into that
Yeah.
is to remind everyone that it is a citizen's duty to surrender to a police officer or law enforcement officer when that officer advises them they're under arrest.
Okay.
The practice of surrendering to that request by that officer is the citizen's insurance policy that that officer will not use violence towards them and treat them in a respectful manner.
Mm-hmm.
So at the point where a person refuses to comply with that officer's request is when the officer will engage in some coercive measures to gain control of that suspect in order to place them under arrest.
So it sounds like there's escalation.
There is indeed. And the escalation is supposed to be modulated by that officer based on the resistance offered by the citizen they're attempting to arrest.
Mm-hmm.
Different municipalities talk about this with different verbiage. And in the Dallas Police Department, it was the force continuum. So at the lowest level of the force continuum is just the uniformed officer's presence. Hello, I'm Officer Mark Steiner. Here I am standing there, dressed in a uniform. I wear a badge on my shirt that indicates that society has imbued upon me the authority to act in society's behalf to keep the peace. And I'm telling you, you're under arrest, so you should listen to me. And if the person complies, then the scenario usually is followed by a very nonviolent handcuffing procedure where the officer will tell the person to turn around, place their hand behind their backs. They'll handcuff them and have them seated in the back of their squad car, being very careful that they don't bump their head as they put them in.
Yes.
And it's not, if executed in that fashion, it's not a violent circumstance. Certainly getting arrested is not fun, and no one wants to get arrested, but the act of being placed in custody by a police officer is not even an indication of guilt. It's just stating that the officer has information in his possession at that point in time that suggests that taking that person into custody is in the interest of society, either to prevent that individual from doing harm or to arrest or capture that individual after he's done something that is in fact a violation of the law.
So it's really at that point just a matter of containing or restraining an individual to ensure that that person is safe and the officer is safe. It's just
and that's indeed correct.
Okay. All right. So let's assume again it's me that's supposed to be arrested, and I'm agitated and upset and unhappy, and am refusing to be handcuffed. What happens next?
Well, there's what the incident you're describing is now passive resistance. So you are not complying with my instructions, but you're not acting aggressively towards me. Okay. At that point in time, again, the force continuum would recommend open hand control techniques. Maybe maneuvering one of your arms behind your back to place you in a position where it would be hard for you to resist and apply a little bit of pressure that would cause you some discomfort. Open hand techniques also include pressure points. There's places on the human body where digital pressure, just a stiff thumb, held very tightly, applied behind the ear, applied to the sternum, applied under the arms, can cause a certain amount of discomfort. And again, these don't cause injury, but they're intended to get compliance by you, the resisting citizen. And you should also know that at the point you do start offering that resistance, technically you are now violating another law. Because again, it is your duty to surrender when a police officer tells you you're under arrest.
Even if I'm misidentified, or perhaps I was driving a similar vehicle as the suspect and things like that, even if I'm completely innocent of any wrongdoing, I still have to be cooperative.
Yes. Remember, that is your insurance policy that the officer will treat you with respect and be nonviolent towards you.
Okay.
Once you surrender that policy and you engage in combative behavior, then it's the officer's sworn duty to act. And the more resistance you put up, the more effort he will put towards getting you in custody.
Got you. So nowadays there's YouTube and there's hundreds and hundreds of postings of individuals who insist that there's been police brutality as they videotape the arrest of somebody, and so on. And I would obviously reasonably understand that not all of those cases are police brutality, but just a suspect that's not being very cooperative and such. There are cases, of course, of police brutality where over I don't know, over effort made by the police officers to apprehend a person causing harm and injury and such. So we understand that there are cases of both justified and perhaps unjustified. What's the review process for a police officer after one of these videotapes are posted online and so on? And of course, there are body cameras nowadays as well. What happens to the police officer? Is there a disciplinary process, a review process, and how does that work exactly?
Uh, all modern police departments in the United States have an internal investigative process. In Dallas, it was internal affairs, and that term is used similarly in a lot of agencies. So that is not for when the officer violates the law necessarily. That is the first level of investigation when a citizen reports to the department, hey, this police officer did something wrong, bad language, excessive force. I mean, it could be, he gratuitously damaged some property, he was driving faster than he should. That's the entry level for investigation for all law enforcement officers. That internal process will determine very quickly whether or not the allegation made against the officer is a violation of the department's policies or a violation of the law.
Right.
If that initial review says it's a violation of the law, then that is handled in an entirely different manner. In large departments, it's frequently handled by other police officers. In some departments, and it's typical in Washington State, they like to hand it to an adjacent jurisdiction. So there's no presumption that the officer or sheriff is going to get treated gently by his peers. They ask an adjoining municipality or county agency to actually do criminal investigations.
So
it's important to remember, though, that once the investigation becomes criminal, that officer is like any other citizen who is alleged to have committed a crime. He has the right to remain silent about that crime. He has the right to an attorney. He has the right to not make any kind of public announcements, and indeed he shouldn't.
Right. So obviously these days in the news, there are cases in which police are accused of wrongdoing, are in front of a grand jury, and they are found that there aren't any charges, there won't be any charges made and such. And of course, some have argued that that's unjust and that these people should be prosecuted. But you're saying that they're regular citizens, and if by review by peers that they didn't commit a crime, then they shouldn't be charged. Is that about right?
That's exactly correct. But then remember, at that point in time when they're not charged, then the investigation then goes back to the internal process where an officer or sheriff can be disciplined professionally up to including firing and having his certification taken away from him, his license to be an officer anywhere.
Sure. I'm thinking this conversation is helpful for people because we haven't heard all the perspectives and such. You've given us a tip that basically we need to be cooperative when when stopped by a police officer and told that we're going to be apprehended and so on and so forth, what other insights or tips can you offer the public, the rest of us, about policing and such that might be helpful for us to have that kind of perspective?
Well, the first tip that comes to mind is just the general reminder to all citizens that police officers are citizens,
Right.
and that the vast majority. I would never assert that there are no police officers or sheriffs or law enforcement officers who are bad people. There are a small percentage of bad apples, as there is in any profession, including yours.
That's right.
But the vast majority of people who wear a badge and a uniform come to that profession because they genuinely want to do good. And they aspire to adhere to some very lofty goals and professional standards, but they are people too. People make mistakes.
Sure.
And the idea that an officer, I'm particularly concerned about the perception now that seems to be very popular, that when an officer makes a mistake that results in someone being injured or killed, that the officer has done something criminally wrong.
Right.
He may have done something wrong. He may have done something procedurally wrong, but absent an intent to hurt somebody or an intent to do malice, he may have just made a mistake. And while he may be retraining or firing, it may seem inadequate to recompense the damage done. It's still a mistake.
Sure.
Let's see, some of the other things, officers don't ask for much when they're doing their job, but a little bit of respect on behalf of citizens goes a long, long way.
All right. So you still are a member of Shelton United Methodist Church, and I wanted to ask you, how has faith informed your work, and how has it helped you to be a better officer?
Great question. I will tell you that when I began my police career, I was fresh out of 7 years of active duty in the Army, and I would have at that point in my life, I would have classified myself as a very the depth of my faith was shallow.
Superficial.
I kind of was going through the motions because I was brought up to be Christian, but I don't honestly believe that I had a very deep faith at the time. I didn't have any epiphany, no magic moments during the course of my career as a police officer, but over time, I found myself turning more and more to Christianity as a way to kind of keep my gyroscope lined up, because I saw a lot of ugliness, and I saw a lot of situations that seemed hopeless, and that nothing, no matter what I did as a police officer, I was ever going to correct the bad trajectory of the lives of some of the people that I was there to try and help. And as I turned more and more, my faith grew deeper as time went on, and I found that it gave me strength to look at some of those circumstances with a little more hope, and even it gave me the ability to offer a little hope. By the time I finished my time on patrol, it wasn't uncommon for me to ask the victim of a crime, and sometimes even an arrestee, if it was all right if I'd say a prayer for them. And I was quite often surprised that even some really hardened people that I would have thought that didn't resonate with at all, it would soften their demeanor when they realized that even if I was placing them under arrest, I thought they were a worthwhile person.
So even in an arresting situation, you could still show and express some compassion.
Yes.
And charity.
Yes, you can.
Right. I can imagine.
And that's.
Go ahead.
I was going to interject one more thing. In today's world, it seems like there's an expectation on behalf of the public for police officers to behave as robots. This idea that they're going to be perfect and do the exact right thing every single time, that robotic response is really not something people want, because it's the care, it's the empathy that police officers feel that allow them to extend that hope and care to the people that they're dealing with.
Sure.
If society and so those very characteristics of care and compassion that cause an officer to have empathy in a situation sometimes may work against him and may facilitate him making a mistake sometimes.
Mm-hmm.
But does society really want law enforcement of robots, or do they want officers with empathy and care?
With humanity.
I don't think they can have the empathy and care and still not have an occasional mistake.
Right. All right. Well, I've run out of time. I'm grateful for the conversation, Steve. I appreciate your insights and so on. And I wish I could talk to you more about certain cases or some other lessons you've drawn from your years of service. But I appreciate your years of service and your willingness to have this conversation. God bless you.
Can I, before you wrap up, can I put one fact out there, one statistic?
Projection? Yes, of course.
Yes.
Go ahead.
Because since you were kind enough to offer me this opportunity to chat, I did get on the internet and do some research last night, and I encourage other people, to use their intellect and look with discernment at everything they see and hear on the radio and TV. Mm-hmm. And I discovered that in the 30 most populous cities in the United States, most of them highly visible in the news, between 2013 and 2019, there was a 37% reduction across the board in officer-involved fatalities of citizens. Mm. And that reduction is generalized over all ethnicities. So the perception that the media is putting out there that there has been some escalation in these encounters with minorities is wrong. The police departments and sheriff's offices in this nation have been consistently doing better and better. I won't say they're perfect, and I won't say that bad outcomes still aren't happening, but the desire to throw the institutions that are making improvements every year, that desire to throw them out and try and start fresh, to me is misguided. And again, I encourage people, whoever's listening and whoever's interested, to do a little research on their own. They'll be surprised what they find.
Little due diligence, which is primary reason why we're having these sort of conversations, so that we can at least initiate the conversation and stimulate thought. There's no doubt that with all the news reports these days, with all the sensational news, one is left with the impression that these things happen endlessly. But yes, statistically, it's actually seen a decline been a trending decline for some time. Again, Indeed. Thank you very much, Steve, for your time. God bless.
Thank you for the opportunity to talk to your listeners. Take care, Don.
Right. Inspired, I suppose, by Law and Order, this will be a two-part session. Today we talked about police officers. In a couple of weeks we'll be interviewing a judge. I hope that you stay tuned and check in a couple of weeks to hear the conversation from a judge's perspective as we explore issues of justice. Now let us offer a word of prayer for police officers. Dear Lord, police officers' days are filled with hazards and uncertainties and unknowns. Help them be wise and invoke all their training and experience prior to taking action in any call. If they discern a quick decision or action is required, direct them to move swiftly, act responsibly, and respond safely for themselves, for the public, and for the suspects. If they need to wait for backup or ask for help, don't let them be prideful or rash, O Lord, but consider the best outcome for everyone who is involved. Dear loving God, we ask that you guide their consciousness, reaffirm their codes of conduct, refresh and remind them of essential protocols, and equip them with steady hearts to achieve good outcomes. And speaking of hearts, O Lord, give them hearts of charity, kindness, and thoughtfulness. Help them to see the good in people, and don't let their hearts become hardened and calloused by the daily challenges, trials, and tests they face. We pray this in your name. Amen.